Robert Wright, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so to begin, I just want to ask a question that will show that I've done tons and tons of research as a way to be incredibly shameless and is not necessarily the best question to actually ask, but just for the sake of bragging. So I know that you have a vested interest in U.S. foreign policy. So maybe I want you to ask a question for how the U.S. can accomplish one of its most important goals. How can the U.S. government deliberately accelerate the pace of AI progress in order to compete well against China?
Well, I don't think that should be the goal. I think the goal should be to slow the race down. So, yeah, I'm not going to help you with how we can beat China, because I think if that's the goal, we're in trouble. We and China are both in trouble.
Yeah, all right. There we go. That's what I was hoping for. So yeah, you say this in your book, and I think it's kind of interesting. Maybe let's dwell on this for a little bit, where you say fear of China had become a kind of linchpin of AI acceleration. It fended off state and federal safety regulations that might slow AI deployment, overwhelmed environmental concerns that might impede the rapid rollout of power-hungry data centers, and ensured that various kinds of support would flow abundantly from the Pentagon and other parts of Washington to Silicon Valley, end quote. So let's enlighten the audience about your views on this.
Well, I think it's a fact that, repeatedly it has happened that if you brought up the prospect of regulating AI in certain ways, or even making AI companies respect copyright laws in gathering the training data, you have sometimes heard from prominent people like Sam Altman and others, no, that would slow us down. And if you ask, what's wrong with slowing down, they say, well, for one thing, there's China. Dario Amodei of Anthropic is particularly bent on beating China. It seems to be central to his worldview. So, it is a fact that the China talking point has been used rhetorically to try to fend off regulation, to call for more government support, and to override various concerns about, how wise it may or may not be to let the technology sprint ahead without much governance. Now, how cynical you want to be about that is up to you. In other words, it could be that some of these people just really do believe in a heartfelt way, ideologically, the competition with China is a big deal. I think my sense has always been that Amodei does to some extent. With other people, it may just be a cynical talking point that they know will help them fend off regulation. But there's no doubt that the theme has had that effect. So that's kind of what I meant. And since I do think a headlong AI race with anybody, certainly including China, is a bad idea, I just thought I would call attention to that.
I definitely agree that there's an AI race. Maybe there's an AI arms race, essentially, between the US and China right now. What parallels would you draw between the AI arms race of today and, say, maybe the nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War?
Well, first of all, with nuclear, it was more obviously an arms race per se. AI has military applications, obviously, like autonomous weapons, and both the U.S. and Chinese government, I'm sure, very much focused on that fact. And I should say that for some people, again, Amodei, I think, is an example. The whole just kind of developing superintelligence generically is thought of as an instrument of kind of hegemonic dominance, partly military, but in any event, it gives you force and power in having your way on the international stage. So, there are some parallels. And of course, I should say, look, nuclear also had its non-military uses. And in fact, we tried to make use of that to control the military uses, a feature of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The deal was supposed to be, well, okay, a few great powers have nuclear weapons. Those of you who will agree to forego the development of weapons will get our assistance in developing nuclear energy. That was kind of part of the deal. So the both do use technologies The nuclear arms race per se was a military arms race, though. A, and B, it was easier to contain. I mean, first of all, it had more in the way of a naturally stabilizing effect. I mean, mutually assured destruction was a thing, and you didn't have to do that much to kind of cultivate that natural stability. In other words, so long as both sides, the Soviet Union and the US, could be pretty much assured that the other side would survive a first strike and have a significant retaliatory capacity, then probably nobody was going to launch that first strike. And actually, that logic, knock on wood, seems to have worked so far. And to kind of make sure that the logic would apply, there wasn't that much you had to do. I mean, there's the nuclear triad, okay? That means we have submarines, we have air, we have land-based. Part of that idea is to make sure that you have a survivable retaliatory deterrent. And then very wisely, and I really would emphasize this, there have been flashes of wisdom in the course of human history. And we did, in I guess the 70s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed not to develop defensive missiles in any magnitude. And that may sound crazy, right? Who doesn't like defense? But we realized that if you could threaten to neutralize the other side's nuclear force entirely with your defensive missiles, then suddenly it became credible to them that you might launch a first strike or that you might do this, you might do that. It was destabilizing. And it might even be tempting for you to launch a first strike. So so we did demonstrate some nuance in dealing with it and some wisdom. Still, it's a much more straightforward problem. Also, these treaties are easier to verify. Nuclear missiles are big things. An AI that exists on a hard drive is much less conspicuous, and so on. Now, some parts of AI are conspicuous. Big training runs. If the world's countries wanted to agree to, slow things down and just pause on big training runs, that could be verified. But on balance, I'd say it's a much more complicated challenge than nukes.
Okay, so maybe for nukes, it's a question of like your own self-interest. Like if I were either the US or the Soviets, I did not need to have empathy for the other side in order to be motivated to not launch nuclear attacks against them because of mutually assured destruction. Where like maybe you're saying that the AI arms race between the US and China is one where each side needs to have a larger degree of empathy towards the other side in a way that was not as necessary during the Cold War. Is that what you're saying?
Well, first, I distinguish between emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Emotional empathy is like feeling their pain, identifying with it, which leads to sympathy and caring about them. Cognitive empathy is just understanding how they're viewing things. Now, cognitive empathy is important with even mutually assured destruction, because you do have to go through the exercise of thinking at a minimum, well, wait, if we launch these nuclear weapons, what are they going to do? And you have to have a good model of that. So cognitive empathy, that is my big hobby horse. Emotional empathy is a perfectly fine thing, but I don't spend much time preaching it, in part because I think the thing that we have mutually assured destruction has in common with the current situation is that I argue that it is in the rational self-interest of the United States and the rational self-interest of China to get together and work things out and avoid a reckless race. So I'm just appealing to self-interest. I'm appealing to self-interest in a non-zero-sum context where there can be a win-win outcome or a lose-lose outcome, but I am just appealing to self-interest.
You're appealing to self-interest, and you use the key word that you always use, non-zero sum. That's a word that always follows you around. Maybe, how about this? Explain how you would characterize the differences between zero-sum conflicts and non-zero-sum conflicts and what that has to do with the current AI arms race between the US and China.
Yeah, well, a zero-sum game, is one in which the, everything that happens is good for one side to the exact extent that it's bad for the other side. I mean, a pure zero-sum game. Like if you're playing tennis with someone, every time you gain a point, they have lost a point, relatively speaking, right? Every game is won by one side, won by the other side. Now, when you play doubles tennis, your relationship to your partner is purely non-zero sum. Again, purely, in the sense that after each point, you have both either gained by a point or you both either lost a point relative to the other side. So those are the pure examples of zero sum and non-zero sum. In the real world, you rarely get things that pure. So, when you buy a car, if you buy it, we generally say non-zero sum game because apparently you felt you would rather have the car than the money. The dealer felt they would rather have the money than the car. They're both happy with the deal. It's win-win. But during the bargaining, when you're trying to reach a price that you're both fine with, every time the price goes up or down by a dollar, one of you has gained a dollar, one of you lost a dollar. So there's zero sum bargaining within a larger non-zero sum context. And in most cases, it's even messier than that in real life. If you think about your relationship with a friend, right? I mean, they're friends. You must think that your interests are aligned to some extent, but the exact extent differs, and sometimes they're not aligned at all. And sometimes you feel like, suddenly you're both attracted to the same potential romantic partner. You've got a highly zero-sum game, unless, of course, you are a rationalist, polyamorous, or whatever Silicon Valley culture is most attracted to polyamory. Anyway.
Yeah, so maybe within the context of AI, maybe the US and China, they believe that they are in a zero-sum game when it comes to AI competition, and you believe that they should pursue interest in a non-zero-sum or like even positive-sum way. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm not sure both sides are convinced that they're in a zero-sum situation. China talks a lot more about non-zero-sum stuff than certainly the current American president. And I would say, honestly, I think they act like it. They believe it a little more than the U.S. has been acting like it lately. I think, how you play the game, whether you perceive the game as zero-sum or non-zero-sum, again, depends partly on how you're reading the intentions of the other. And a very common feature of human affairs that often leads to war is for each side to view some things the other does for defensive reasons as offensively intended. And when you do that misreading, that's a failure of cognitive empathy, but it happens all the time and it can become a positive feedback cycle. So, World War I was a good example of an arms buildup where at every step they said, well, we're just building up our arms for defensive purposes. The other side looked at it and went, oh, this is a threat. They could attack any moment. We need more arms. It goes back and forth. So you can always get people to acknowledge usually that in principle, there's a non-zero sum dynamic and there are things the U.S. and China have in common. And in fact, at the Beijing summit, I think because it came in the aftermath of all this publicity about this super hacker anthropic mythos model, China and the U.S. agreed to initiate a formal dialogue on AI safety. I think what they have in mind mainly is non-state actors being a threat to both of them. They have a mutual interest in controlling, therefore, the diffusion of the technology. And that's good. That's the apprehension of a true non-zero sum situation. So at any given time, the relation between two nations, you can almost always find some realm where they recognize a non-zero sum dynamic and some realms where they don't. And they may not exist. There are sometimes, depending on how you define your goals, you may be in a zero-sum game. If it's a struggle over territory, the Palestinians and Israel have for decades been playing what, in terms of territory, is a zero-sum game. Every acre that goes to one side doesn't go to the other.
Wait, so you said that the U.S. and China recently came to an agreement and they were they came to that agreement in because of like they were trying to oppose non-state actors. Is that what you said?
I believe that was the concern. That was what people were talking about. I mean, I don't think the administration has elaborated much on what's going to happen, although I gathered that in September, I think there will be signs that the dialogue is happening when Trump goes. I think he's going to China again. But the understanding, the closest thing to a consensus understanding of what had motivated the Trump side, at least, to want to talk to China about this was the fear that non-state actors could get a hold of this stuff. I think there are other things to worry about with super hacking stuff. It could be destabilizing, and for example, if it does come from a non-state actor, well, whether it does or not, if somebody takes down your power grid and you don't know who did it, and like some China hawks convince you it was probably China, then you can imagine a president who is perhaps not very wise and kind of mercurial. I'm not saying America could ever have such a president, but you can imagine that. And you can imagine retaliation based on the false inference that this was China, or vice versa. Because cyber attacks are very hard to confidently attribute to a source, and so it's just a dangerous world where you have two nuclear armed countries that have kind of an adversarial relationship, and suddenly the power to launch a cyber attack that could be attributed by either to the other, suddenly that power could be in the hands of, God knows who. And that's a possibility that is now raised by this technology.
What if tomorrow the world suddenly got attacked by evil invading space aliens? Do you think that would be a net positive for the ability for different countries within the world to unite?
Not necessarily. It would depend on the perceptions. Mm-hmm. I mean, like if it looked like, well, they're only interested in the northern hemisphere for whatever reason, then maybe nations in the southern hemisphere would say, well, let's just do a deal with the aliens. I mean, they don't mean us any harm. Let's help them conquer the northern hemisphere. So there's all kinds of reasons, like COVID. People say, well, COVID, wasn't that non-zero sum? Well, actually, there were a lot of zero-sum games within it. Finite supplies of vaccines, finite masks, and so on. So, and then, of course, there were all the politicians in whose interest it is to inflate animosity. That didn't help. But certainly, look, if you look at various things that could unite the whole human species, or at least enough of it to act as a cohesive global community, which I think is what the response AI deserves, invaders alien invaders would be pretty good, because they have, first of all, especially if they purported to want to conquer the whole planet, and secondly, human beings seem to be designed by natural selection to respond kind of viscerally to certain kinds of threats more than others, namely the kinds of threats they faced during evolution. And what kind did they face? Well, animate threats, largely, like other people, groups of people, maybe animals. So something abstract like climate change, where, you show them a graph and try to get them worried, it's not as viscerally galvanizing as a bunch of creatures who were approaching your planet. So, that might be kind of distinctively galvanizing. It's going to be very interesting to see what the psychological effect of AI is exactly along this dimension, because it is, on the one hand, there's something about it for almost everyone to dislike, or certainly for a lot of people, but there's also something in it for almost everyone to like. I mean, so it's, how many people will start to worry that it could get out of control and take over the world, which is, of course, one scenario. How many people will worry that a reckless arms race could lead for just rogue AIs to escape and just do damage to, the world's communication infrastructure or whatever? What these perceptions are and how they are counterbalanced by the perception that it can do a lot of good, which it in principle can. will help shape how we react to this. And it's just so weird. I mean, we're right now in what seems to be a kind of a phase of obvious acceleration, and most people in the community feel that way. And
Well, there
it's
are some people who would reject the premise that we're undergoing obvious acceleration and would say that AI progress is slower than a lot of people would
yeah, I
say.
mean, maybe you can make their case for them, and I could respond. I'm not sure how you keep saying things like that, but um, I mean that you know, do you want me to start with the reasons it does seem to be accelerating?
Go for it.
Well, I mean, for starters, there's this famous this group meter METR. They had this really interesting metric for AI progress. They look at like, okay, what kind of demanding tasks can the best LLM out there perform with, say, 80% success? And then they measure how long it would take a human to do it. So it's like human task time as a gauge of how sophisticated the AI is. And they've charted the growth of human task time for now, years, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or something. And they found that it's doubling. Originally, they said every 7 months. Now it seems to be doubling even faster. But whatever, even if it's a constant doubling rate, that's an exponential graph. And if you look at it, you realize it looks like it's going vertical. Okay, so it kind of putters along at 6 seconds, 12 seconds, 24 seconds. That was like a few years ago, and now we're up beyond 12 hours, headed for 24 within months, although it's getting to the point where it's actually hard for them to do the measurements, but there's that. Okay, that's acceleration. There's the fact that I don't know, a year ago, had AI solved any truly historically challenging math theorem? Conjecture, proved it as a theorem. I'm not sure, but in any event, a few months ago, a bunch of mathematicians got freaked out by it's doing this one kind of so-called Erdos problem. And then a week ago, OpenAI unveiled 10 challenging math problems, and mathematicians were blown away. Now, I think they have not all been, math proofs. Sometimes you think you proved them, and then it turns out you didn't. There could be some of that, but there's just a number of dimensions along which, the rate at which new models come out, the extent to which each generation's model is participating in the design of the next generation, that's growing. Yeah, which means you're moving toward, at least in the direction of what's called recursive self-improvement, where in theory, there's no human in the loop. The AI just keeps making better copies of itself. So now you tell me, what are these? Are these still using the term stochastic parrot or something? What's their argument?
The last I checked, like the meter graph, I don't think 50% success rate is like a useful benchmark. But more importantly,
well, they do both 50 and 80, and I will say something. If it costs 1/10 as much as a human, every corporation in America will say 50% is fine. Thank you. Sign me up. Where do I write the check? Okay. Humans, here's a story. I had surgery for cancer a little more than a year ago. When I first got the MRI report that indicated first clear sign I had cancer, I hadn't talked to a doctor. I showed it to an AI. I'm like, well, what does it look like? It basically is like, well, this doesn't look good. This doesn't look good. That doesn't look good. I said, well, why didn't you mention this line that starts abnormalities found in, and it said, I think the radiologist meant to put the word no at the beginning of that sentence. And you know what? It was right. Humans screw up all the time. So, if you're waiting for an AI to do a job with, 100% success rate, you're waiting for an AI that fits the description virtually no human worker has ever fit. 50% success rate, depending on the cost, is fine.
50% success rate is fine?
Well, do you understand what I just said? If I'm paying a worker $100,000 a year to do a task, and 95% of the time he brings it back, and I go, yep, that's right, congratulations. And I can pay a total of $20,000 for AIs, and half the time I have to say, no, go do it again. I will take that deal. That's what I'm saying. It's all about cost effectiveness. Okay. But anyway, look, Meter also does the thing at 80%, and they get the same finding, a doubling time of every 6 months or whatever it is. And look, I have employed a number of workers. I have often looked at a worker and thought, man, I'd settle for 80%. They're not that good. I mean, this is the fact that Meter is using the 50 and 80%. I mean, they could go back and do it with 90%, and I'm sure you'd see the same curve. That is not. I don't think that's a good objection. But
Okay.
I mean, just look at the real world. 2 years ago, humans were doing all the coding at like Anthropic, virtually all. Now they're doing virtually none. This is just happening. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be, I don't know whether you are I don't know what your actual position is, because I know you're just standing in for a skeptic, but it's like, it's so frustrating because the world, if you believe what I believe, the world is just not ready for this. And so many of the arguments you hear about why it's actually less than meets the eye just don't seem to me to hold water. I mean, there's been a particularly frustrating correlation between thinking AI is bad and thinking it's not powerful. There really, for a long time, less now, been this dichotomy like, oh, AI is great. It's going to be so powerful. It's advancing so fast. And then people saying, it's not great, it's bad, and it's not advancing very fast. Well, what if it is advancing fast, but it's not necessarily good? That's I think, I mean, of course, doomers have always said that, but I'm talking about like kind of mainstream opinion that there has tended to be among kind of tech commentators, especially, tended to be that dichotomy.
You said that you're afraid that you're afraid the world is not going to be ready for the changes that AI would lead to. What do you think the world is not ready for?
Um, well, for example, the geopolitical destabilization that could ensue, some of which I described in imagining a cyber attack that was hard to attribute, but there's also a scenario that was outlined in a paper called Superintelligence Strategy. They didn't really highlight it. It wasn't the main point of the paper, but it's in there, which is if China and the U.S., two superpowers, are racing to superintelligence and both believe that superintelligence will confer completely hegemonic power and will be used to their grave disadvantage, which is, again, that is the worldview of Dario Amodei. He wants to race to superintelligence and bring China to its knees. Then it is in the rational interest, arguably, or at least there's a real risk of this happening, of the country that's behind even by a couple of months as you approach superintelligence to stage, dramatic preemptive action to disrupt the progress of the other country. Like could be cyber attacks, which itself could lead to world war, but in this context. But it could also be kinetic attacks on data centers and stuff. So there's that destabilization. There's the loss of control scenarios, I think, are real. They're not the first thing that I think we need to worry about, but could they happen eventually? Yes. And there are various gradations of them, like, super hacking AI gets loose and does huge damage to, as I said earlier, communications infrastructure. And there's, of course, the complete sci-fi scenario of a takeover. Can't quite rule it out. It's not what I stay up worrying about. There's bad actors using it to build a bioweapon or again, using it as cyber attack. The thing I think doesn't get enough attention is just the collectively destabilizing impact of all the little big impacts along various fronts, like jobs. It could be that all the people whose jobs get done by AI find other jobs, or they kind of radically amend what their own job is to adjust. But still, if that happens on a large enough scale, it is dislocating. Not everyone will respond well to it. Society has to figure out how to handle it. And, if meanwhile all these other things are happening, parents are worried about losing their kids to these bots they're spending so much time on. And in some cases, it is a problem. In some cases, it isn't. It's going to, AI is going to, I think, left to its own devices, unless we intentionally counteract this, it's just going to reduce the amount of meaningful contact among human beings, because more and more things that people used to do for me, AI is doing. It used to be like, well, I don't know, where do I get who would know how to fix this gadget? Who would know where I get a good plumber? Who would know this? Who would know that? And of course, the online world has for some time been somewhat reducing the need for other human beings to answer these questions, but it's also been a way to reach out to them and get the answers and make the contact. And now, increasingly, AI can answer anything for you. For some people, it will become a substitute to at least some extent for human friends, for human romantic partners. I feel pretty confident all this is going to happen. I'm not saying any of it will end badly in and of itself. I'm just saying, if all this stuff hits society at once, and just things like people walking around with glasses that, for all you know, are filming you and identifying who you are and digging up your Twitter history. They see you on the street and suddenly they know, your last 100 tweets. That's just weird. It just takes, there's just a lot of stuff that takes adjusting to. And when countries have a lot of people freaking out for different reasons, bad things happen. Bad things happen politically. Bad people take power. It's just, I've just never been so sure in my life that slower would be better.
So one thing that I find really interesting about your commentary as a whole, and this is not just when you were writing the God test, this is like something that you've been known for decades, would be the idea, and this ties into one of the cognitive biases that you like to talk about, which is attribution error, which is like, the more you can demonize a certain group, the more you can paint them as nefarious, the more you can become worried about them, the more you can become afraid of them. And the more you become worried or afraid of that group, the more that justifies taking drastic action against that group. Could you describe the types of phenomenon that you are known for in that?
Well, yeah, attribution per se can figure in the dynamic you just described. It can do a lot of things, and just to explain, the concept has kind of evolved as they've learned more about it. Originally, the idea was just that humans tend, in explaining the behavior of people, they tend to attribute too much to the kind of person they are, disposition, and too little to the situation they're in. And so, for example, somebody's rude to you and rude to a clerk in a checkout line in front of you, and we all tend to go, that person's a jerk, without considering the possibility that maybe they just found out that their spouse is gravely ill, and without pondering the fact that we've all been rude to somebody on a bad day. As time went on, they realized it's actually more subtle than that. And, whether you attribute more to disposition or the situation, that is itself, you might say, situational. Depends on the situation, depends on your relationship to the person and what they've done. So with friends and allies, if they do something good, we tend to think, okay, yeah, that's the kind of person they are. They're good people. If they do something bad, you tend to explain it away with circumstance. So if it's your daughter misbehaving, they didn't get their nap or whatever, you're less inclined to reach for that kind of explanation for the bad behavior of other kids, especially if it's a kid whose parent you're already at odds with, right? Then you're going to reach for it's just a bad kid explanation. And as it suggests, if it's an enemy or a rival, then it's when they do something seemingly good that you seek a situational, circumstantial explanation. Like, well, they were just showing off. There was this one particular person they were trying to impress by being nice. They're not really nice. But if they do something bad, you don't think, well, maybe they'd had a bad day. You think, no, it's a bad person, right? It's like, if it's just like a romantic rival or something, if you really pay attention and reflect on your reactions, I think you'll agree. That's the way we think of rivals, enemies, adversaries. The good things they do can be explained away often. The bad things are a reflection of their inherent nature. Now, back to the dynamic you described, one thing this means is that once you may have noticed that people who want to invade a country go to great lengths to paint the leaders of the country in the darkest possible terms. And I know, there are probably people out there thinking, but wait, they are bad. Well, yeah, I mean, you're in America and you read the American media, and yeah, they're always presented as bad. And they always have something bad about them, and maybe they're in some sense worse than our leaders. Although when you look at all the leaders we've had, I think you'd agree, not all were saints. In any event, the logic, the implicit logic behind, locking in that view of a leader or regime as just bad is that then they can't get out of the box. Like, if they do something conciliatory, it doesn't really reflect it doesn't mean you can really do business with them. I mean, you saw this before the 2003 Iraq War. Saddam Hussein, people forget, we said, we're going to attack you if you don't let in international inspectors from the UN to look at your sites. And he said, well, okay. And we're like, So he let them in, and they looked around. They didn't find anything. And they were using the list we gave them, okay? The places we were sure that were the WMDs. And finally we just said, okay, look, we're going to invade. The invaders have to get out. And it just gets back to cognitive empathy. I mean, the whole point about attribution error is it impedes cognitive empathy. It impedes an accurate understanding of what's going on inside the person's mind. And with Saddam Hussein, once he's an enemy, you're not going to go through looking for reasons he could not want the scientists taken out of the country, other than him being this villain with these WMDs. In retrospect, it's very easy to come up with reasons. Maybe they had all kinds of secrets he doesn't want to disclose. Maybe he thought they'd defect, and that would be embarrassing. But we didn't think that way. We had him in the enemy's box. We had already concluded, he's evil, got to invade, and no amount of evidence that invasion that contradicted the premise that invasion was imperative would be accepted. I mean, the main moral of that story to me is cognitive empathy. Try to clarify your view of what's going on in everyone's mind, friends, enemies, adversaries, and try to recognize that there are these cognitive biases like attribution error that make it hard. And it's not easy to see when they're distorting your perception, right? It's not obvious. It takes, a certain kind of reflectiveness, and you have to pay attention. Pay attention to the emotions that are being triggered by different kinds of people. But anyway, the way this all comes back to AI to me is, I think if we do not confront this challenge as a cohesive global community, we are in deep trouble. We cannot keep having these, I hate to use a word as like ridiculous for something that's as grave as killing tons of people in a war, but these wars are ridiculous. I mean, so happens the Iran war is an example so glaring most people even see it this time. But, anyway, we can't afford them. And, we have long been, I think humankind's long been moving toward a degree of non-zero sumness in terms of the actual relationship among nations, their actual common interests, that we've needed to put war aside and cooperate on more and more things. And I think AI is just the final test. I mean, that's why the book is called The God Test. It's the kind of test that God would give. Either become better people, get clearer in your vision, get better in your moral conduct, get better at understanding people on the other sides of fences, or pay a big price. I think that's where we are with this technology.
So humans will naturally develop in groups and out groups. We'll naturally see some people as friends and some people as enemies. So maybe what you're saying is that you want humanity to unite, and in order for humanity to unite, we need to see AI and AI progress as the out group. Like we need to see the idea of AI is getting smarter as the enemy that we need to vanquish. And that's why we need to come together to stop AI from progressing as fast as like the AI, both the AI doomers and the AI accelerationists think is the pace at which AI is progressing. Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
at an abstract level, we need to appreciate that AI creates a strong non-zero sum dynamic among people and among nations. It is in their self-interest to cooperate. Now, as for in groups and out groups, as it happens in human evolution and history, one big source of strengthened non-zero sumness within a group has been the existence of a threatening external group. And so
like evil invading space aliens, like that would be an external.
that would be an external group. But I want to emphasize that, what that means. That's just so the ease with which we identify a hostile out group and unify in response as the in group is a manifestation of the deeper non-zero sum logic. And the fact that in the modern world, threats don't always materialize in this familiar form that natural selection kind of prepared us to deal with is a big challenge. AI is not going to look exactly like space aliens. Space aliens would be something kind of, generically familiar, a group of animate beings that pose a threat. AI is going to have some things in common with that. I mean, it does feel like an intelligence to a lot of people, but it's this weird thing where sometimes you use it feels like a very friendly intelligence, but you have to recognize that if we don't control it in certain ways, it could pose a threat. So it's just, I would like us to respond. I mean, it's not that I really want AI progress per se to be viewed as this hostile force, because it can bring a lot of good. But I do want us to view the completely untrammeled arms race approach to AI, not just an arms race between nations, but between corporations. I mean, they're all, many companies are cutting corners because they're in a race with other companies. That's why government regulation happens, is because companies, in pursuing their own interests, can't be expected to take into account the negative externalities their behavior generates. That's what a government is supposed to do. But it's not AI advance per se that is the problem. It's uncontrolled, rapid, reckless AI advance. Now, might the day come where I say, look, we're better off just stopping it here right now if we can? Because actually, at this point, further advance per se would be a threat. It's conceivable, but it's not the situation, I think we're in now. I mean, I'd be fine with a pause on big training runs if we could coordinate that globally, because it would slow things down. It certainly wouldn't bring them to a grinding halt. I'd be fine with that, but it's the quality of, it's the properties of this particular progress, which is, I just think, too rapid and reckless, and lacking in, thoughtfulness and reflection.
Let's say that humanity decided to coalesce around one world government, like the UN, but more powerful, or the UN suddenly became more powerful and had much more authority. Like, would you support having that one world government be ruled by that, like a single, like authoritarian dictator, if that authoritarian dictator could control the pace of AI progress?
Well, no, I mean, that's what I'm, I mean, look, if you gave me some thought experiment and said, well, you've either got this authoritarian dictator and life is like this, or you've got AI crushed everyone on the planet, or you've got, I don't know, you could think up a thought experiment where I guess I would say even authoritarianism is better than the alternative you've presented. But my basic position is if we want to avoid an authoritarian world government with undue concentration of power, which it's in everyone's interest to avoid except for the person who would be running that government, maybe, we should start thinking now seriously about how you thoughtfully cultivate international governance on a small scale, addressing, problems in a, in a thoughtful way, and try to get it right, and never try to avoid ever getting to a point where you're granting any large amount of power to any small group of people. You want to keep it democratic if you can. Now, whether it's democratic in the sense of one person, one vote everywhere, or just in the sense that, one nation, some number of votes, maybe based on population or whatever. There's all kinds of, like the UN itself is not a very egalitarian institution. 5 countries get veto power at the Security Council. What do they have in common? They were on the winning side of World War II. That's it. I mean, they were unusually powerful countries because it takes powerful countries to win world wars. But, that's a pretty contingent fact that you've got an institution where 5 countries have veto power. And, I think there's no such thing as a government that is truly, utterly, completely egalitarian. In the U.S., if you break a law, you have a much better chance of going to jail if you're poor than if you're rich. I don't applaud that. I wish it were otherwise. But, anyone who's waiting for global governance that is entirely egalitarian in its distribution of power is going to be waiting a long time. But I think we should come as close to that as we can. And avoid centralizations of power. And even right now, I think we should be looking around and going, wait a second, do we want so the richest guy in the world controls one of the 5 most powerful large language models. He's got all these contracts with the government. The president is this guy who doesn't seem super scrupulous. I mean, I would say, and the president is asserting this authority to, basically just keep AI models off the market. And by the way, I think the government should have that authority, but the authority shouldn't derive from one president just declaring that he has the power without Congress saying he does. So I'm all about worrying about concentrations of power in the age of AI, and we need to do it now in a national context. And if we do succeed in building structures of international governance, we're going to need to do it in that context. But I don't see an alternative, because if we stay in this world where, nations spend much of their time engaged in needless conflict and wars, I just don't think we'll get to the degree of international collaboration that this technology demands. And again, I think it demands more than any technology of the past by a long shot.
So one interesting thing that I read from your book is that back in 2023, Sam Altman spoke very plainly about the need for international coordination in regulating AI.
Mm-hmm.
And he is responsible for one of the large language models that is growing at a very rapid pace in a way that I'm guessing that you would strongly discourage the pace of growth within ChatGPT. I'm wondering if there's always a potential that you might end up creating the thing that you're trying to stop. Do you think that there might be any possibility that we might end up creating an authoritarian government because of our fears that AI might end up creating an authoritarian world government for us?
Well, why don't you sketch out the scenario a little more? I mean, so which person who fears authoritarian government might, why don't you just elaborate a little? I'm not sure what you're...
All right. Could you explain the concept of the singleton?
Well, the singleton It's an idea that was advanced by Nick Bostrom, first in a paper and then in his book, Superintelligence, which was widely read by people like Sam Altman and, that whole crowd, like whenever it came out 10, 15 years ago. And he had a chapter on the singleton. A singleton is just a global coordinating mechanism. So as he says, it could be a democratic, decentralized system of global governance that would be really nice. It could be an authoritarian system, or it could be an authoritarian. It could just be run totally by machines. They could, put the people in prison or kill them or whatever, and just machines would control, like, the processing of resources or whatever. Any system of global coordination, he would call a singleton. And so my view is, I think his chapter on the singleton, to me, suggests, when he looks at the different ways it could happen, it did help convince me that with this technology, probably one way or the other, you are going to get to a singleton. You are going to get to some form of global governance. I don't have time to elaborate on why exactly I think that, and there are bad ways to do it that lead to a lot of human suffering and ultimately stamp out human liberty. And there are better ways to do it, and I vote for the better ways. But to say that technology is pushing us toward some kind of singleton or another is just to say that, maybe we should focus on what kind of system of planetary coordination we want.
Yeah, and you're saying that system of planetary coordination, like, if we do nothing, it will be like an AI dictator? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if we do nothing, not necessarily an AI dictator, but I do think if we do nothing to constrain the technology, you are likely to get, violent destabilization, owing partly to sudden shifts in power and people, grasping the golden ring of AI and trying to use it. One scenario is the one I mentioned, where a race to superintelligence leads to a preemptive action that leads to nuclear war. That's a super bad outcome. And in the wake of, what I would say generically, when societies are in disarray and disoriented and chaos reigns, that's when authoritarian leaders have the easiest time seizing power. So, and this is my, reply to Dario Amodei, not that he's asked, but he's very concerned. He thinks that China's goal is to turn America into an authoritarian country or something. I have not seen evidence of that, but that's his concern. What I would say to him is a breakneck race in AI is going to so destabilize American society that I think there's a pretty good chance you'll wind up with an authoritarian takeover within the U.S. So in racing to, in his mind, stave off some kind of external authoritarian takeover, you may usher in authoritarianism through the back door.
Robert Wright, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Great questions. I appreciate the time.